I have a difficult task. This is not an easy subject that has been assigned to me. Although my field of study is philosophy of religion, and I do an awful lot of lecturing on the theme around the world, I also want to be very, very sensitive, because it is easy to bring offense when you're dealing with something like this. It is easy to trample underfoot truths and ideas that others greatly treasure. And none of us wants that done to that which we believe, and why end up doing it to what someone else believes. That is the positive and the noble aesthetic side of it. But the counterpoint is, how does one really ever come to grips with truth if it is not put in contrast with conflicting truth claims? What do you do when there are conflicting truth claims? And therefore, what I would like to do, ladies and gentlemen, as I introduce my message, is first of all set the foundation for the laws of logic, that two contradictory statements both cannot be true. Only one of them may be true. Both of them may be false, but both of them cannot be true unless the laws of logic do not apply to reality. And if one denies that the laws of logic apply to reality, how do we ever even converse? The moment you open your mouth, you assume a meaningful statement is about to be made. And if somebody challenges that statement, how do you anchor anything in reality? I mean, a scientist like Dr. Alberts cannot possibly take two conflicting measurements for the same thing. A pilot listening to the guidance that is coming from the tower is not going to take two opposite numbers both to be true, unless in one sense one of them becomes qualified, asserting something else. So what I'd like to do is first establish the laws of logic. Some of you may be familiar with that argument, but many of you may not be, and so I'd like for you to hear that. But the second thing I want to do is deal with the major attacks that Christianity has had to face, particularly from Islam. So I'm not going to deal with Islamic doctrine. I'm not going to try and debunk any of their doctrines. I'm just going to try to present to you what is the problem the Christian faces in trying to communicate somebody who holds to a Muslim worldview. What is the difficulty the Christian faces in communication? And I can assure you, I will do that as sensitively as I can for at least a couple of reasons. Not that it is, first of all, the proper thing to do, but I have the privilege by many Islamic governments around the world to be in their country and lecture and dialogue. And this year is no exception. I will be in 3 Muslim countries speaking, and they are kind enough to host me. I want to be respectful of the fact that they are willing to give us a hearing. And the other thing is, I have some of the greatest respect for 1 or 2 fine Islamic scholars around the world today, particularly one by the name of Jamal Badawi in the United States, who is a very fine gentleman and makes dialogue much easier as we talk. I will highlight the tensions that I have presented in such situations, and they realize it, but it is important to know that. Having set the logical base, then having set the greatest tension in a dialogue with the other monotheistic worldview that is principally trying to in some way undermine the Christian faith, if not explicitly, implicitly, then I will move on to the uniqueness of Christ in world religions. I won't have time to deal with the pantheistic worldviews that other Eastern beliefs adhere to. If those of you who are interested, we have a lot of material where you analyze pantheism again within itself rather than just in a comparison of the two. J.N.D. Anderson, who now writes under the name of Norman Anderson, has written very heavily in the field of comparative religions. One of the finest books he has written is called Christianity and World Religions. Sir Norman Anderson, operating out of England, is a scholar still writing, although in his senior years, very much an authority in history, philosophy, and law. And in his book, Christianity and World Religions, he gives 3 major distinctives that come under the category of a unique proclamation, a unique salvation, and a unique disclosure. I greatly encourage you to get a hold of that. It is very succinct and very well done by a fine contemporary thinker. Here is the law of logic as it applies to reality. I remember speaking, please bear with me for those of you who are familiar with this illustration, but it is the most incisive one that I can give to you. I remember speaking in one of the United States western cities when one of the professors was attending the lectureship and asked me to speak against an Eastern religion, which I said I would not do. He said, I'm an American, I belong to that other Eastern religion, let's just call it X. And he said, and I have taught this X religion in my lectures and so on. I want you to speak on the subject why you do not subscribe to the dogma of religion X. And my students will take you apart after your lecture. I said, no, I really don't want to do that. I said, I've learned when you throw mud at others, not only do you get your hands dirty, but you also lose a lot of ground. And he accepted that. I said, but I will tell you why I am a Christian. I will speak on that subject. At the end of the talk, he was quite vociferous in his denunciation of what I'd said, and he basically took me to task at the front of the lecture room, attacking the fact that I didn't understand logic and so on. I said, look, we're not going to get anywhere. Let's go out for lunch. You pay, and I'll pray, and we'll get together. So we got together for lunch, and he brought a professor of psychology with him, and the psychologist and I finished our lunch while the philosopher hadn't even started his. His food had become congealed in front of him, and he had taken off these paper placemats of all the tables to draw out his argument. And basically what he was trying to say was this, that there are two kinds of logic. Actually, he was wrong, there are more. But he said there are two kinds of logic. One is the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction means if something is true, the opposite of it is false. If something is true, the opposite of it is false. It is called an either-or logic. If I say to you, for example, there is a red car parked immediately outside the steps there, if that statement is true, the opposite of it is false. I am not at the same time saying that red car is not parked out there. It is either true or false. I've just given you a simple illustration. If it is A, then it is not non-A at the same time. You basically establish the either-or dogma. And he says, Ravi, that is the law of non-contradiction, that is either-or, that is a Western way of thinking. Westerners think either-or. I said, I disagree with the last statement. Why don't you rub it off? He wouldn't do it. So then he moved to the Eastern way of thinking. He said, in the East, you do both and. It is a dialectic. You don't say either this or that. You say both this and that. Karl Marx used the dialectical system. It was not either the employer or the employee. You put them together and you find a classless society. Both employer and employee join together in a classless society. Funny thing, they never show you one, but they talk about it. That there is a both and dogma in the dialectic, two poles of an argument there. And he says, you see, Ravi, he said, the dialectical system is Eastern. The dialectical system is Eastern. And I said, why don't you cross out that last line? Because I don't agree with you, but he refused to cross it out. What he was trying to say was this. I had talked about the many contradictions in certain pantheistic worldviews, very strong contradictions. And he said, you see, Ravi, if you took the dialectical system to be true, anytime you came into a contradiction, you won't be puzzled by it. You'll say, this is the way they think. They make opposite statements, and both of them are right. So if you ask one follower of religion X, is God personal? He says yes. You ask a second follower of religion X, is God personal? And he says no. You go to the third person and say, which of these two is right? And he says, both of them. He says that's an Eastern way of thinking. So you've got the either-or, which is Western, the both-and, which is Eastern. And he was waxing eloquent on this, going on and on and on. Finally, I said, can I say something to you, sir? He said yes, and he picked up his knife and fork and started to cut into his first morsel of food. And as he was cutting into the morsel of food, I said, here's what you've told me. There is an either-or, which is Western. There is a both-and, which is Eastern, and you want me to study religion X, right? Now, here's my question to you, doctor. Are you telling me when I'm studying religion X, I either use the both-and system or nothing else? Is that right? That I either use the both-and system or nothing else. Is that right? Do you know what he did? He put his knife and fork down, and with a very nervous expression, I wish I had the cameras there to film it, he says to me, the either-or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? I said, yes, in fact, I've got some shocking news for you. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us. Do you see what he was doing? He was using the either-or with which to prove the both-and. He was telling me I either use this system or nothing else. And he was staggered to realize that he used it every day. So it's not got nothing to do whether it's Western or whether it's Eastern. It's got everything to do with that which best reflects reality. And when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no man comes unto the Father but by me, it is a most reasonable statement. The question is it true? It is a most reasonable statement because truth, by definition, is exclusive. The moment you affirm something, you exclude anything that challenges that. And the way you prove the law of non-contradiction is by just talking, and if anyone else stands up and challenges you against it, by challenging you, they are proving you right. That it is either what you're saying or what they're saying. Now, the Easterner understands this malady. That's why the Easterner says, when the mouth opens, all are fools. But the problem is his mouth opens to tell us that. Or as one of the famous mystics said, he who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know. Well, did he speak? And if he spoke, then he does not know. And if he does not know, does it really matter if he spoke? The law of non-contradiction must apply to reality. If you deny the law of non-contradiction, you may as well talk about a one-ended stick. It cannot even be pictured, leave alone stated. Because the opposite poles are very much in your mind of an either or there. Now, it is therefore more logically possible that all the religions in the world are wrong, but it is not logically sensible to say that all the religions in the world are right. It just can't be. The pantheist affirms something very different to the theist. The theist affirms something very different to the atheist. And you go on and right down the line, and you find out that two contradictory systems cannot really be true. Now, this is really the fundamental problem that I find as a Christian lecturer and a philosopher dealing with the Islamic worldview. I find at least 4 basic challenges that they give to us that are impossible to meet, that are absolutely impossible to meet, because in the process of them stating those arguments against Christianity, those arguments end up, in a sense, self-destructing. And by the way, I have debated some of the best of them in the other part of the world. They have never really responded to this challenge. I'm not talking about their fundamental doctrines. I'm talking about their philosophical assumptions. The first problem I find is this. You see, if their prophet is espoused by them, which he is, as being a prophet to the world, he is espoused by them as being a prophet to the world, not just to Arabia or to the Middle East. He is the last and the final prophet to the world, and he, they say, performed no miracles because there was no need for it. The Quran is in itself a miracle. But here's the problem. The Quran is in Arabic. And I am not given the privilege of even challenging its word usage. Please remember, this is vital. Because you see, when you take words or changes in the Quran, which they will tell you have never made, although some great scholars like Ali Dashti from Iran challenge that assumption, the fact of the matter is, unless I know the language, I cannot perceive the miracle. Unless I know the language, I cannot perceive the miracle, which basically means there are millions of people in the world to whom the language in which their scriptures are written will ever remain completely foreign, and the miracle becomes purely one affirmed by those who know the language. It can never be tested in your experience because the English translations, they tell you, and any other translations are not accurate except the original as given in the original language. How does one deal with a miracle that is not recognizable by the masses in society? That presents the first problem. There is a second problem it presents to me. They abolish our authority, which is the scriptures, without an original with which to condemn ours. So we are told by the scholars representing that view that the Bible we have is not the original Bible given. It is a corrupt Bible, that there are many contradictions in it. It is not an accurate reflection of Jesus Christ. For example, they espouse that Jesus never really died on the cross, and therefore the resurrection was purely a fabrication of later collectors of the ideas. Now, let me ask you this. How does one ever know something to be truthful if there is not a unit by which to measure it? There is no point of reference. If I were presented with an original that clearly debunks what we do have, then the dialogue can begin. But if I'm told what I have is error-prone and wrong on the basis of something they have never shown to me, how does one begin to dialogue? Do you see the problem? It is like talking about the moon being so far away from here, but saying we have no way to measure it, but take my word for it, that's how far it is. It has destroyed our original authority and told us we have no authority now. Therefore, the Bible has been taken away from the Christian, and the Christian has got nothing left to defend because he does not have the original Bible. How does one begin a dialogue with that? Thirdly, and very importantly here now, as you know, the Quran was written about 6 centuries after Jesus Christ. Now, their problem was that what has happened is that the original absolute which was given has been lost. Now remember, their belief in a sovereign God, a very sovereign God, but the original revelation as given in what they call the Injil, the Gospels, has been lost. Now 600 years later comes the latest and the greatest and the final revelation, which means B succeeds A 600 years later, and B overrules A because A is lost. And what we believe is now false, therefore B has to overrule A. Question. If that is the way an absolute can be overruled, what is to keep C from coming in 6 centuries from now and overruling B? And after all, isn't that what Joseph Smith really did in the founding of Mormonism? That's precisely what Joseph Smith did. He said all of the religions of the world coming centuries after Islam, for example, Mormonism said, all of the revelations have all become corrupt. Now he has come out with the last and the greatest and so on. So absolutes keep overruling absolutes without any point of reference for the previous absolute. It is philosophically unarguable. You cannot talk about it because there is no more a possibility of discussing absolutes. That is number 3. And number 4, this is a sad one, but it is true. Many scholars of that school of thought reserve the right to impugn and debunk truths that we hold about our Lord. But you cannot do the same with the names that are precious to them. You follow what I'm saying? I can be told in the Quran that Jesus never died, which is what it is said out there. And I can have people look at me and say that this is a blasphemy. Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God, which is completely wrong. He does claim to be the Son of God. There are all kinds of concepts that are treasured truths. The very cross and the empty tomb are so precious to us, and the very person of Christ so precious to us. How does one dialogue with 2 people talking while A reserves the right to impugn what B is defending, but B is not given the same privilege of closely scrutinizing what A is defending? These points of tension make meaningful dialogue very, very difficult, with all respect for the scholarship. That's all I want to say to you about that system. And I believe it is a hatpin in the heart of that system because it philosophically does not really cohere in its fundamental assumptions. I have several others, and I've got hours of material on that, but I just leave that with you. So we've established the law of non-contradiction, that the laws of logic apply to reality. We've established the fact that we have been attacked by one principal other philosophy around, our belief system around today, but that belief system self-destructs in its philosophical assumptions. So let me take the person of Christ and his uniqueness in the religions of the world. And I'm sure between my brother Alberts and brother Cassidy, as they have so beautifully portrayed some of the fundamental doctrines, there will obviously be some overlap here, but if you bear long enough, you will see how marvelously the applications move from one mind to another, each with its distinctive strength. First is Jesus' description on the reality of human nature. The reality of human nature. He knew what was in the hearts of men and women. Many times as he talked to his antagonists, or as he talked to those who had bitter questions about him or against him. When he replied to them, the Bible says he knew what was in the heart of man. And he faced the temptations that Satan cast his way also without sinning himself. But he showed us the reality of the human nature with which we all live. I have not gone into a detailed study of this hellish act that has taken place recently, of that little 2-year-old child so brutalized and savagely murdered by 2 10-year-olds. In England, how do you explain that? Where does all this come from? Where does one come upon a Hitler or a Stalin? Or where does one come upon racism and the bitter specter of it in many, many parts of the globe, not just here or in the United States, but in even the Far East or even in the land of my birth, where there is such tension between different colors of people in a land that talks about equality so much? How does one explain it? Are we really going to change the human heart by better education? Are you really going to take away the lust in my heart by writing some great book on physiological theories? Are you going to take pride away from me by just telling me that somebody else had a downfall because of his or her pride? Are you going to take greed away from me just by telling me, look what happened to Donald Trump, he messed his whole thing up, so you shouldn't be coveting all this riches? How does one change the longings of the human heart? Malcolm Muggeridge put it best when he said this. He said, the doctrine of depravity is the most debated doctrine in society, but it is also the most empirically verifiable. You cannot deny it. Let me give you a classic illustration that comes to me from the pen of Muggeridge himself. And when he began to realize what kind of a person he was, as you know, he was editor of Punch magazine. I had the privilege of being with Malcolm Muggeridge a few months before he died, one of the great thrills of my life in his beautiful home in Sussex, England, as we walked his gardens and talked about all that he had learned in these 80-some years of his. And Muggeridge said he was teaching journalism in India, and how all of a sudden, early one morning, he went out to swim in the river nearby, and when he went out to swim in that sunrise, there was nobody there, but way out in the distance, he saw an Indian woman coming to have a bath. And Muggeridge, though a married man, decided this was going to be the moment of his crossing the line and betraying his trust to his wife, Kitty. And he struggled within the cauldron of his own unholy passions, almost in that Augustinian sense, one pulling him in one side and another in the other. But the more he riveted his attention upon her, he thought this was be it. After all, here was a white, Western, successful man. There was a poor Indian village woman. He would proposition her and she would respond. So he swims towards her and he describes the passion within his heart, raging like a swirling river within him. Even though something within him said, don't. He said, I swam harder to get away from that which was restricting me. And as I came closer and closer and emerged from the water and shook the water off my eyes, I was face to face with this Indian woman until I suddenly realized as I opened my eyes, I was looking into the face of a leper. And as she lifted her hands up, no fingers, the eyelashes and the eyebrows all gone, and the nose just eroded away with that dreadful nerve disease. And as he stared at her, looking almost animal-like at him with her eyes sunken in a state of shock, what are you doing so near a leper, sir? He said, I was on the verge of saying to her, what a lecherous woman, when it hit me between the heart, as hard as it could be hit. What a lecherous heart I had. Just a few days ago, I was in a city that I shall leave unnamed, on a very high floor, the top floor of a building, by one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, extraordinarily wealthy. I will not name the city or the company, although I don't think there'd be any betrayal, but let me just keep it that way. And he and I talked for about 2 hours after a talk that I had just given. And he kept talking about the fact that he doesn't want to believe in God, but he does want to believe that some things is right or wrong. And he said, I see this right or wrong around me every day. I see the flaunting of ethics. I see the immorality. And as we dialogued, the Christian businessman who'd taken me to talk to him suddenly broke in with a brilliant question. He said to this businessman, he said, you know that I love you, and so I think I have the right to ask you this. He said, you've been telling Ravi all along how much you despise the immorality that you see around you. And he called him by name and leaned forward and said, What do you do with the evil that you see in your own heart? And I was so glad the man interrupted. He said, I don't know. I guess I would have to say that whenever I express it, it is a victimless act. I said, do you recall, sir, when Prime Minister Konoye of Japan died or committed suicide, he left on his night table the book by Oscar Wilde, De Profundis, and he had underlined one line there which said this: as terrible as it was what I had done to others, nothing was as terrible as what I had done to myself. Evil is not victimless. It victimizes the very person. Like one of the judges at the Nuremberg trial said, after I took the life of the first innocent man, I was no longer the same person. What do you do with this? How are we going to change it? How are we going to change it? I have a beautiful story that I tell. I love it so much. Nothing expresses it better. Of these two very wealthy men who were rather immoral people. Both of them were pretty bad in their behavior, and they were notorious in the city. And all of a sudden, one of them suddenly died. And so the surviving brother went to the local preacher and said, would you preach at my brother's funeral? And the preacher didn't want to do it, but the surviving brother said, I'll give you a fat lot of money, and named the amount. He said, I'd like you to preach at the funeral, and only do me one favor. In the middle of your eulogy of my brother, he assumed there was going to be a eulogy, he said, in the middle of the eulogy of my brother, will you just refer to him as a saint? And I'll pay you what I said I would. The preacher was a good business manager and decided to take on the challenge. And the day of the funeral came, and he waxed eloquent, and he said, the man you see lying here in the coffin is a murderer, he's a liar, he's an adulterer, he's duplicitous, he has done every dirty, rotten, stinking thing your mind can think of, but compared to his brother, he's a saint. Who are you compared to someone else? You may be a saint compared to someone else, but the Bible describes sin not only in transgression, it describes sin as coming short of the glory of God. Coming short of the glory of God. And I want you to know that the powerful treatment that Jesus gives to this whole issue of the nature of man and sin is felt more and more in our world today than ever before. Just think about it. The 20th century has been the most bloodletting century in history. Think about that, and we are supposedly in the age of progress. I think of what's going on in Yugoslavia. I think of the hurts around the world. I think of the slaughter of infants in all the rights that we now claim to ourselves. I think of the tragedy, so much so that one recent appointee of President Clinton, when he was being quizzed by the Senate Committee for his confirmation, described the world as 1,000 points of darkness. 1,000 points of darkness. One of the men I had as a hero in my teenage years was the great tennis player Arthur Ashe, who just died of AIDS very recently in the last 2 to 3 weeks. He was a gentleman on and off the court, and through a blood transfusion contracted that disease and died. I did not hear it directly, but my sister quoted it to me, and I was using it at Harvard University some time ago speaking, and all of the students nodded their head when I said it, so I assume it is exactly as it was communicated to me. He said, I have lived with a lot of pain in my life, including AIDS, having gained it innocently. He said, but nothing has hurt me more, please hear me, than the pain that I have felt for the rejection of my race. Think of that. A man dying of AIDS, saying to you, not to me, you and me, to the world, nothing has hurt me more than the pain I have experienced before the rejection of my race. The lips of dying men seldom lie. How are we going to change this? How are we going to change this? Please believe me, it will never happen just because we institute new laws in any land. Unless we understand the nature of the human heart and the unique answer that Christ gives, we will never be able to change it. Listen to Hobart Maurer, one-time president of the American Psychological Association. who ultimately ended up committing suicide. And the American psychologist in 1960 said this: "For several decades, we psychologists looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus and acclaimed our liberation from it as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free in this sense, that is to have the excuse of being sick rather than sinful, is to court the danger of also becoming lost. This danger is, I believe, betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living mean?" The reality of human nature is best portrayed in the teaching of Christ. And even secular atheistic psychologists, as Hobart Maurer was, said something has been lost when we lost the understanding of the dogma of sin. And he said when he wrote that article, he received more letters to him than any other thing he'd ever written. He was trying to recover a concept of sin. The reality of human nature. Secondly is the spirituality of genuine worship, the uniqueness of Christ, the spirituality of genuine worship. Jesus rescued us from the tyranny of limiting worship to geographical boundaries and buildings. You hear that? He rescued us from the tyranny of restricting worship to geographical locations and buildings. Do you know that entire tragedy, which India Today captured under 2 words on the front page of their cover of the India Today magazine? India's shame is what it called it, the destruction of the mosque by some fanatics, because they said it was holy ground and belonged to one of the gods of their mythology and so on. How tragic to inflict things like this while men and women were killed, children were killed, because worship was restricted to a certain geographical location. When you go to the Old Testament, you see something fascinating happening. God is describing the dimensions of the temple. And as he is describing the dimensions and how the tabernacle for Moses, he says this: make it so high and no higher, so wide and no wider, so long and no longer. Use such and such a material, use such and such a person, use such and such colors. There were very specific directives. There was no equivocation on it. This is the way it had to be. And Moses complied. But you see, in our day, we have church buildings. We don't have tabernacles or temples of old where specific directions were given. Why is that? Because as Christ taught us, we don't go to the temple anymore. We take the temple with us. So when 300 people gather together for worship, it is not 300 people going into a sanctuary, but 300 sanctuaries gathering at a point so that we could be rescued from the tyranny of a locational worship. And how this body has become sacred because of that. To think that on these flesh and bones, God himself has branded the fact that I can house the very living God. Christ in me. That's what David Livingstone, the last words he etched on a rock, Christ in me. David Livingstone, Christ in you as a believer. Jesus gave us the reality of human nature, the spirituality of genuine worship. Thirdly, the purity of his own person. I heard my brother Michael talking about that. The purity. Which of you convinces me of sin? I find no fault in this man. But what I think I want to draw here is very significant. I know the last time I was here, I gave you that beautiful thought, which is like a treasured nugget in my own life now. Remember what I mentioned to you, how the pursuit of the Hebrews was light? The Lord is my light and my salvation, and the pursuit of the Greeks is knowledge, and the pursuit of the Romans was glory. The Hebrews pursued light, Greeks knowledge, and Romans glory. And I said how the Apostle Paul said God has caused his light to shine in our hearts to give to us the light and the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus. Remember how in the convergence of the person of Christ, light, knowledge, and glory converge? Let me stretch that point a little more. Please follow now. Anything you create at best will be somewhat different from you. Anything you create at best will be somewhat different from you. It may be similar, but never be essentially the same. So an artist can do a self-portrait, a sculptor can do a self-portrait on stone, and you can create all kinds of pieces of music, of works of art, and so on. It may be a similarity to you, but it will be different to you. Only that which is begotten is identical to the begetter. And Jesus Christ is the begotten of the Father. I and the Father are one. And in that Garden of Gethsemane, this one who is begotten of the Father, impeccable and spotless, prays, and in his praise he refers to God as his Holy Father. As his Holy Father. Now here's the dramatic truth in Christian faith. When the Holy Spirit works within our heart, that internal touch, we become begotten of the Spirit. And when we are begotten of the Spirit, and the Christ comes and lives within us, we can lay claim, because of his purity, his work, and his regeneration, we too can turn to God and call him Holy Father. So the purity of Christ is not merely an abstract dogma. That purity which is so marvelous that light, knowledge, and glory converges. There is no religious teacher in history. I repeat that. There is no prophet in history. There is no apostle in history. None of them can ever affirm what Jesus did. Even, in fact, the Quran refers to him as born of the Virgin without any fault. Softening word, but there is that sinlessness about our Lord, and then that begetting work in his purity. So we see the reality of human nature, the spirituality of genuine worship, the purity of his own person. Fourthly and quickly, the unity he gives in life's diversity. The unity in life's diversity. Do you realize that the greatest pursuit of the philosophers has been to find unity in diversity? To find unity in diversity. Socrates tried it, Plato tried it, Aristotle tried it. Aristotle's best-known student was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great tried to take Aristotelian philosophy and unify the world in Greek language and Greek thought. Unity in diversity has been a historical pursuit. In fact, the very word university means trying to find unity in diversity. In the American coins, you have these words, e pluribus unum, which means out of the many, one, the melting pot, but finding unity. The very word quintessence, which literally means the fifth essence, comes from the Greek philosophers, when you think back, that they said there were four essences: earth, air, water, fire. Somebody said, what is the fifth essence that unites these four essences? What is the quintessence of life? So whether it's a pluribus unum, university, unity in diversity, or whatever it is, do you realize, in order to explain diversity in the unity and diversity in the effect, I am more and more convinced there would have to be unity and diversity in the first cause, and only in the Christian dogma is there unity and diversity in the doctrine of the Trinity in the first cause. You see, the unity and diversity within the doctrine of the Trinity and the community that is established, distinction, yet identity and purpose of being one in all of that. How does this work out in life? The unity and diversity doctrine coalesces my own life. It coalesces my own life in the worship of Christ, whom I can worship in spirit, internally, and in truth within boundaries that he's established. Archbishop William Temple defined worship in these words. He said, worship is the submission of all of my nature to God. It is the quickening of conscience by his holiness, nourishment of mind by his truth, purifying of imagination by his beauty, opening of the heart to his love, and submission of will to his purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. Quickening of conscience by his holiness, nourishment of mind by his truth, purifying of imagination by his beauty, opening of the heart to his love, and submission of will to his purpose. The coalescing of all of my faculties in the unity of worship. Do you remember the film Chariots of Fire? How the Scottish runner Eric Liddell is charged or challenged by his sister in that film. She says, Eric, you're giving up so much in order to win this gold medal. And he says to her, Jenny, God has made me for a purpose, for China, but he's also made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. You see, not only his missionary activity was an expression of his worship of God, so was his running on the track and field. And when his gold medal was over with, it was over with, he'd won it, he was gone, on to a missionary in China. And he lived his life of worship, which was coextensive with all that he did. So we worship not only when we take the Lord's Supper, we worship even if we are out in a tennis court, taking the exercise that the body needs as an expression of my gratitude to God. Worship is the unity in diversity. So we've got here in Jesus The reality of human nature, the spirituality of genuine worship, the purity of his own person, the unity in life's diversity, and lastly, the continuity of life beyond the grave. The continuity of life beyond the grave. It is interesting to read in the Quranic writings where they describe that Jesus did raise people from the dead. That is found in the Quran. Very interesting that he did raise people from the dead. Of course, today our entire Christian doctrine hangs on that peg. And Paul said, if Christ be not raised from the dead, then our faith is all in vain. But put yourself in the place of the disciples who all of a sudden lost it when they saw him on 2 pieces of timber dying such a shameful death. And then his body is taken and tucked away. They were hiding like a bunch of frightened Boy Scouts, not knowing what to do with their tomorrow themselves. And as they pondered that, in the marvelous breaking of the chains of death, as Jesus emerged alive, as he prophesied he would destroy this temple, he said, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And you go back right to the Old Testament, you see the prognostication of his resurrection. You see it in the New Testament, too, very different to some of these mythic legends that people espouse, some remote mystery religion somewhere. But here it is, he said death would not be able to hold him. He was going to go back to be in glory with his Father, prepare a place so that we could go. And that dogma of the resurrection fuses life with such hope and such guarantee, because our home is not just here for now, but our home is ultimately in a realm with God himself. Have you ever pondered on this one idea? What would you do to frighten Lazarus after he'd been raised from the dead? Is there anything you could do to say to him, I'm going to scare you, Lazarus, i.e., I'm going to kill you? There is a well-known play by Eugene O'Neill entitled Lazarus Laughed, because Caligula is going around killing the Christians, and everybody is getting scared until he bumps into Lazarus, and he says, Lazarus, I'm going to kill you if you're a Christian. Lazarus goes, ha ha ha. And the argument goes back and forth, and finally says, Lazarus, one more ha 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 out of you, and you're going to be a dead man. And Lazarus bends over in uncontrollable laughter, now comes up for air and says, haven't you heard, Caligula? Death is dead. Death is dead. How do you frighten somebody who's already been there and knows the one who's going to let him out, not going to let you out? G.K. Chesterton wrote it so beautifully. In the words, he put words into Lazarus' bound body coming out of the tomb. He says this, after one moment when I bowed my head, and the whole world turned over and came upright, I walked again where the old road shone white, and heard what men said. The sages have 100 maps to give that trace their crawling cosmos like a tree. They rattle reason out through many a sieve that stores the dust and lets the gold go free. And all these things are less than dust to me, for my name is Lazarus, and I live. All these things are less than dust to me, for my name is Lazarus, and I live. Billy Graham said once, he was in the offices of Konrad Adenauer, the mayor of Cologne and the chancellor of Germany succeeding Hitler. And Adenauer asked for Billy Graham to come and visit him. And he looked at the young evangelist eyeball to eyeball, asked him a lot of questions. And then he went over to the window looking across the ruins of his city. And he says, Mr. Graham, I want to ask you a question. He said, do you really believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Do you really believe in the resurrection of the dead, those who are in Christ? And as he looked over the debris of his befallen city, Billy Graham, the nervous young evangelist, said, Mr. Adenauer, if I didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead from the dead because of Christ, I would not be preaching the gospel. And Adenauer continued to look outside, and this great 20th century statesman said this to the young evangelist. He said, Mr. Graham, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind. Outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind. I promised to read you these words earlier on. Let me end with this, and then I'll be through. Believe me, I've clipped a lot, but you're grateful for that too. G.K. Chesterton ends his classic book, Orthodoxy, with these words, because I think of the joy that awaits us when we see him face to face, our Lord in all of his purity and his splendor, And in his high priestly prayer, he prayed that we would be with him so that we could see him in his glory. I think of Peter, James, and John at the top of the mountain, so stunned by the transfiguration. What is heaven going to be like? Because was it not Don Wurtson, the songwriter, who said, when engulfed by the terror of tempestuous seas, unknown waves beside you before you roll, so at the end of trials and so on is your destiny, and when fear and conflict seizes your soul, he said, but just think of stepping on shore and finding it heaven, of touching a hand and finding it God's, of breathing new air and finding it celestial, of waking up in glory and finding it home. That's the destiny, the bliss. Here is a marvelous way in which Chesterton ends his book, Orthodoxy. I love this stanza. I wish I could quote it verbatim, but I'd lose some of the beauty he has here. Joy, which was the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. Listen to that again. Joy, which was the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. You see, because for the pagan, only the peripheral questions are answered. The fundamental ones are not. Therefore, joy is peripheral for him, and sorrow is fundamental. For the Christian, joy is fundamental and sorrow is peripheral. So joy, which was the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. And as I close this chaotic volume, I open again the strange small book from which all Christianity came. And I'm again haunted by a kind of confirmation. This tremendous figure of Jesus which fills the Gospels towers in this respect, as in every other, above all the thinkers who ever thought themselves tall. His pathos was natural, almost casual. The Stoics, ancient and modern, were proud of concealing their tears. He never concealed his tears. He showed them plainly on his face at any daily sight, such as the far sight of his native city. Yet he did conceal something. Solemn supermen and imperial diplomatists are proud of restraining their anger. He never restrained his anger. He flung furniture down the front steps of the temple and asked men how they expected to escape the damnation of hell. Yet he restrained something. I say it with reverence. There was in that shattering personality a thread that must be called shyness. There was something that he hid from all men when he went up to a mountain to pray. There was something that he covered constantly by abrupt silence or impetuous isolation. There was some one thing that was too great for God to show us when he walked upon our earth, and I have sometimes fancied that it was his mirth. I have sometimes fancied that it was his mirth, his joy, his laughter. And I say to you, that is the glory that John saw in the Revelation, and the beauty of what was going on. No longer everyone fell down and said, holy, holy, holy. This Christ, who understood the reality of human nature, through his purity, bringing unity and diversity, ultimately has the continuity in our lives to take us to our very heavenly dwelling. There is no one in history like our blessed Lord Jesus, and that is the truth, as he is unique amongst the religions of the world. May God bless you.